This story began quite ordinarily, like many others. A young woman named Ellie worked at a small design company that specialized in creating advertising materials. The office was located in an old four-story building in the heart of the city. The building had seen better days, with its creaky floors, flickering lights, and an elevator that always seemed to be on the verge of breaking down. But it was cozy, and Ellie had grown used to its quirks over the 2 years she had worked there. It was a Friday evening, and most of her colleagues had already left for the weekend. Ellie, however, had a deadline to meet. A major client needed a campaign proposal by Monday morning, and she had volunteered to stay late to finish it. She didn't mind working alone, it was quiet, and she could focus better without the usual office chatter. The office was dimly lit, with only the glow of her computer screen and a few overhead lights illuminating the space. The hum of the air conditioner was the only sound breaking the silence. Ellie was deep in her work, her fingers flying across the keyboard, when she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible noise. It sounded like a door creaking open somewhere down the hallway. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keys. The sound didn't repeat, so she shook it off, assuming it was just the old building settling. But as she returned to her work, the feeling of unease lingered. She glanced at the clock, 9:47 p.m. The office was empty, or at least it was supposed to be. Ellie tried to focus, but the silence felt heavier now, almost oppressive. She decided to take a break and grabbed her mug to make some tea in the small kitchenette down the hall. As she walked, her footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the empty space. The flickering fluorescent light above the kitchenette buzzed faintly, casting strange shadows on the walls. She filled the kettle and set it on the stove, her back to the hallway. That's when she heard it again, a soft shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet. Her heart skipped a beat, and she turned around slowly, half expecting to see one of her colleagues. But the hallway was empty. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. There was no response. Ellie told herself she was being paranoid. It was just the old building playing tricks on her. She poured the hot water into her mug and stirred in the tea bag, trying to shake off the feeling of dread. But as she turned to head back to her desk, she froze. The office door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar. She was certain it had been closed earlier. Her breath quickened as she approached the door, her mug trembling in her hands. She pushed it open slowly, peering inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway. It was one of the storage rooms, filled with old files and unused office supplies. Everything seemed to be in place, but the air felt colder, almost icy. Ellie quickly closed the door and hurried back to her desk, her heart pounding. She sat down, trying to calm herself. "It's just your imagination," she muttered under her breath. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The hours dragged on, and Ellie found herself glancing over her shoulder more often than she cared to admit. The office felt different, alive in a way it shouldn't be. Every creak, every flicker of the lights, made her jump. She considered packing up and leaving, but the deadline loomed over her, and she couldn't afford to fall behind. At around 11:30 p.m., she heard it again, the shuffling sound, this time closer. It was coming from the hallway outside her office. Ellie's blood ran cold. She grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed her coworker John's number. He was the only one who might still be awake at this hour. The phone rang once, twice, and then John's groggy voice answered. "Ellie. What's up? It's late." "John, I'm at the office, and I think someone's here with me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What? Are you sure? Did you check the security cameras?" Ellie's eyes darted to the small monitor on her desk that displayed the live feed from the office security cameras. The screen showed the empty hallways and darkened rooms, just as they should be. But then, in the corner of the screen, she saw it, a shadow moving across the hallway near the storage room. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "John, I see something on the camera," she said, her voice shaking. "I think someone's in the building." "Ellie, get out of there right now." "I'm calling security." She didn't need to be told twice. Ellie grabbed her bag and bolted for the door, but as she reached the hallway, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the office into complete darkness. She fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to navigate the pitch-black space. The shuffling sound was louder now, coming from all around her. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps as she made her way to the stairwell. The elevator was out of the question. It was too slow, too unreliable. She pushed open the stairwell door and started down the steps, her footsteps echoing in the narrow space. But as she reached the third floor, she heard it, a voice, faint and distorted, whispering her name. Ellie. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice was coming from above her, in the darkness of the stairwell. She didn't dare look back. She ran down the remaining flights, her legs burning, until she burst through the door into the lobby. The security guard, a man named Tom, was standing by the front desk, looking concerned. Ellie. Are you okay? John called me. She nodded, too out of breath to speak. Tom quickly escorted her out of the building, locking the doors behind them. As they stood on the sidewalk, Ellie glanced back at the office building. The windows were dark, but for a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in one of them, watching her. Tom noticed her staring. What is it? Nothing, she said, shaking her head. Just nothing. But as she walked away, the feeling of being watched stayed with her. She knew she would have to go back to the office eventually, but for now, she was just grateful to be out of there. The next morning, Ellie returned to the office with John and Tom. They searched the building thoroughly, but there was no sign of an intruder. The security footage from the previous night showed nothing unusual, just Ellie working at her desk and then running out in a panic. But as Ellie sat at her desk, trying to focus on her work, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still there, watching her from the shadows. And she couldn't help but wonder if she had been truly alone that night after all. Ellie tried to push the events of that night to the back of her mind. She told herself it was just stress, fatigue, or maybe even a trick of the light. But as the days turned into weeks, the strange occurrences didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent, and more unsettling. It started with small things. Her desk drawer, which she always kept closed, would be slightly open when she arrived in the morning. Papers she had neatly stacked the night before would be scattered across her desk. At first, she blamed it on the cleaning crew, but when she asked the building manager, he assured her that the cleaners didn't touch personal items. Then there were the sounds. Late at night, when she was the only one left in the office, she would hear faint whispers, like someone was having a conversation just out of earshot. Sometimes, she would catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of her eye, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. One evening, Ellie decided to confront her fears head-on. She stayed late again, determined to finish a project, but also to see if she could uncover the source of the strange occurrences. She brought a small flashlight and her phone, just in case the lights went out again. As the hours passed, the office grew quieter, and the usual sounds of the building seemed to fade away. Ellie was deep in her work when she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on glass. She looked up, her heart racing, and realized the sound was coming from the window behind her. Slowly, she turned around. The window looked out onto the dark alley behind the building, and at first, she saw nothing. But then, as she leaned closer, she noticed something, a faint smudge on the glass, like a handprint. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the handprint was on the inside of the window. Before she could react, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the office into darkness. Ellie fumbled for her flashlight, her hands trembling as she turned it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating her desk and the surrounding area. But as she swung the light toward the window, she froze. There, pressed against the glass, was a face. It was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. Ellie screamed, dropping the flashlight as she stumbled backward. The light rolled across the floor, casting eerie shadows on the walls. When she looked back at the window, the face was gone. She grabbed her phone and called John, her voice shaking as she told him what had happened. He arrived within minutes, along with Tom, the security guard. They searched the building from top to bottom, but there was no sign of an intruder, no broken windows, no unlocked doors, nothing. "Ellie, are you sure you saw something?" John asked, his voice filled with concern. "I know what I saw," she insisted, though even she was starting to doubt herself. "It was there, John. I'm not imagining things." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "This building is old. Maybe it's, haunted or something." Ellie laughed nervously, but the idea stuck with her. Over the next few days, she began researching the history of the building. What she discovered sent a chill down her spine. The building had been constructed in the early 1900s and had served as a factory for decades. But in the 1950s, it had been the site of a tragic fire. Several workers had been trapped inside, and not all of them had made it out. The building had been abandoned for years before being renovated into office space. Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that the face she had seen in the window was connected to the building's dark past. She started noticing other things: cold spots in certain areas of the office, the faint smell of smoke in the air, and the feeling of being watched, even when she was alone. One night, as she was packing up to leave, she found an old photograph tucked under her keyboard. It was black and white, faded with age, and showed a group of factory workers standing in front of the building. One of the workers, a man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile, stood out from the rest. He looked exactly like the face she had seen in the window. Ellie's hands trembled as she held the photograph. She didn't know how it had ended up on her desk, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't alone in the office. And whatever, or whoever, was there with her wasn't going away. Ellie knew she couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. The face in the window, the whispers, the cold spots, it was all too real. She decided to take matters into her own hands. If the building was haunted, she needed to understand why. And if there was a way to put whatever, or whoever, was there to rest, she was determined to find it. She spent the next few days digging deeper into the building's history. She visited the local library, scoured old newspaper archives, and even tracked down a few elderly residents who remembered the fire. What she learned was both heartbreaking and horrifying. The fire had started in the factory's basement, caused by faulty wiring. Most of the workers had escaped, but a few had been trapped in the storage rooms on the upper floors. Among them was a man named Samuel Hargrove, a factory worker known for his quiet demeanor and unsettling presence. Samuel had always been an outcast, and some of his co-workers had even accused him of starting the fire deliberately. Though it was never proven, the rumors had persisted long after his death. Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that Samuel was the face she had seen in the window. The photograph she had found matched the description perfectly. She wondered if his spirit was trapped in the building, unable to move on. But why was he reaching out to her? And what did he want? One night, Ellie decided to confront the presence directly. She stayed late again, but this time, she came prepared. She brought a voice recorder, a flashlight, and a sense of determination. She sat at her desk, the office eerily quiet, and spoke into the darkness. "Samuel," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "I know you're here. I know what happened to you. If you're trying to tell me something, I'm listening." At first, there was nothing. Then, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the air grew heavy. The flashlight flickered, and Ellie's breath came out in visible puffs. She heard the shuffling sound again, closer this time, and the faint whisper of her name. "Ellie." She pressed the record button on the voice recorder and held it up. "What do you want, Samuel? Why are you here?" The response was faint, almost inaudible, but the recorder picked it up. When Ellie played it back later, her blood ran cold. The voice was raspy and distorted, but the words were clear: "Help me. Find it." Ellie didn't know what it was, but she was determined to find out. She spent the next few days searching the building, starting with the storage rooms where Samuel had died. It was there, in a dusty corner of the third-floor storage room, that she found it, a small, rusted metal box hidden behind a stack of old files. Inside the box was a collection of items: a faded photograph of Samuel with a woman and a child, a handwritten letter, and a locket. The letter was addressed to Samuel's wife, apologizing for the rumors and swearing his innocence. The locket contained a tiny picture of the woman and child from the photograph. Ellie realized that Samuel hadn't been trying to scare her, he had been trying to communicate. He wanted someone to find the box, to clear his name, and to let his family know the truth. The fire had taken his life, but the rumors had destroyed his legacy. With the help of John and Tom, Ellie tracked down Samuel's descendants. She handed over the box and explained what had happened. The family was moved to tears, grateful to finally have closure. They held a small memorial service for Samuel, and Ellie attended, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in weeks. After that night, the strange occurrences in the office stopped. The whispers, the cold spots, the face in the window, it was all gone. Ellie still worked late sometimes, but the office no longer felt oppressive. It was just a building again, quiet and ordinary. As for Samuel, Ellie liked to think he had finally found peace. She kept a copy of the photograph she had found, a reminder of the men who had reached out from beyond the grave to tell his story. And though she never spoke of it to her co-workers, she sometimes felt a faint warmth in the air, as if Samuel was thanking her. The experience had changed Ellie. She no longer took the quiet moments for granted, and she had a newfound respect for the past. But most of all, she had learned that sometimes, the things that go bump in the night aren't trying to hurt you, they're just asking for help. And sometimes, all it takes is one person to listen. It was supposed to be an easy night. Mark had volunteered to cover the late shift at the call center where he worked. The pay was better, and he liked the quiet. The office was usually empty after 10 p.m., and he could catch up on his backlog of emails without distractions. But tonight, the quiet felt different, heavier, almost suffocating. The call center was located in a modern office building on the outskirts of town. It was a sleek, glass and steel structure, but it had one quirk: the security system was outdated. The motion sensors often malfunctioned, setting off false alarms in the middle of the night. Mark had learned to ignore them, but tonight, the alarms were silent. Too silent. He sat at his desk, the glow of his computer screen the only light in the room. The rest of the floor was dark, the rows of empty cubics stretching out like a maze. Mark was used to the emptiness, but tonight, it felt wrong. Like he wasn't alone. The first sign that something was off came around midnight. Mark was typing up a report when he heard a faint clicking sound, like someone tapping on a keyboard. He paused, listening. The sound was coming from somewhere in the office, but it was impossible to pinpoint the source. He stood up and walked down the aisle, peering into the darkened cubicles. Nothing. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. There was no response. Mark shook his head, chalking it up to his imagination. He returned to his desk, but the clicking sound continued, faint but persistent. It was distracting, and after a while, it started to grate on his nerves. He put on his headphones and turned up the volume on his music, trying to drown it out. An hour later, the music was interrupted by a loud thud. Mark jerked in his seat, pulling off his headphones. The sound had come from the break room, just down the hall. He hesitated, then grabbed his flashlight and went to investigate. The break room was dark, the refrigerator humming softly in the corner. Mark scanned the room with his flashlight, but everything seemed normal. Then he noticed it: the chair by the table was overturned, as if someone had knocked it over in a hurry. He righted the chair, his unease growing. As he turned to leave, he heard it, a soft, rhythmic breathing, like someone was standing right behind him. His heart pounded as he spun around, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The room was empty. "Okay, that's it," Mark muttered to himself. He decided to call security. But when he picked up the phone, there was no dial tone, just static. He tried his cell phone, but it had no signal. The Wi-Fi was down too. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. He grabbed his keys and headed for the elevator, but when he pressed the button, nothing happened. The elevator was out of service. He cursed under his breath and made for the stairwell. The stairwell was pitch black, the emergency lights flickering weakly. Mark's footsteps echoed as he descended, the sound unnaturally loud in the confined space. He was halfway down when he heard it, a voice, faint and distorted, coming from above him. Mark. He froze, his hand gripping the railing. The voice was familiar, but he couldn't place it. He forced himself to keep moving, his heart racing. But as he reached the next landing, he heard it again, closer this time. Mark. Don't leave. He broke into a run, taking the stairs 2 at a time. The voice followed him, growing louder and more insistent. By the time he reached the ground floor, he was out of breath and drenched in sweat. He burst through the stairwell door into the lobby, only to find it empty. The security desk was unmanned, the monitors dark. Mark didn't stop to think. He ran out of the building and didn't look back until he was in his car, the engine roaring to life. As he drove away, he glanced at the office building in his rearview mirror. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure standing in one of the windows, watching him go. The next morning, Mark returned to the office, determined to figure out what had happened. But everything was normal. The security guard was at his desk, the elevator was working, and the phones had a dial tone. When Mark asked about the night before, the guard looked at him like he was crazy. "I was here all night," the guard said. "Nothing happened. You must have been dreaming." Mark didn't argue, but he knew what he had experienced. He started paying closer attention to the office, and over time, he noticed little things, strange noises, flickering lights, the feeling of being watched. He tried to brush it off, but the memories of that night stayed with him. One evening, as he was leaving work, he ran into one of the janitors, an older man named Carl. Carl had worked in the building for years, and Mark decided to ask him about it. "Hey, Carl," Mark said casually. "Has anyone ever reported weird stuff happening here at night?" Carl paused, his expression serious. "You heard it too, huh?" Mark's stomach dropped. "Heard what?" Carl leaned in, lowering his voice. "They say this building was built on an old burial ground. Some folks think the spirits don't like us being here. I've seen things, shadows moving, voices when no one's around. But I keep my head down and do my job. You should too." Mark didn't know what to say. He thanked Carl and left, his mind racing. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he couldn't deny what he had experienced. And as he walked to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still watching him. From that night on, Mark never volunteered for the late shift again. But sometimes, when he worked late, he would hear the faint clicking of a keyboard or the sound of breathing behind him. And he would know, he wasn't alone.